Do you trust the Russians?
No.
Why not?
Period. Why not? They broke every agreement they ever made with me. That's why I don't trust them.
Stalin will not stop of his own volition. He can only be stopped.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe.
What you're looking at is maybe one of the most famous documents in geopolitical history. It was made in February 1946, right after the end of World War II. And at this time, America was in a bit of an awkward position because they don't really have any ideas on what to do about their big and powerful wartime ally, the Soviet Union. Throughout World War II, America and the Soviet Union had decent relations. They were out of necessity, sure, but they were still decent. And the US president of that time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, played a big part in fostering those relations. He'd been at it for years too. One of the first things he did as president in the early 1930s was to officially recognize the Soviet Union, something the Americans had put off doing for a decade.
Was the desire of both countries for peace.
Roosevelt took a flexible approach with the Soviet Union, and the Soviets for their part came to appreciate him for, at the very least, his non-antagonistic policies towards them. But before the war is over, Roosevelt dies, and all the complicated post-war questions are left to his vice president, Harry S. Truman, who was extremely inexperienced in terms of foreign policy. Initially, Truman had more or less hoped for a kind of peaceful coexistence with the Soviets after the war, but there was friction over agreements about democracy in Eastern Europe that had put that idea into question. While the Americans debated on how exactly they should deal with the Soviet Union, a development occurred. See, Stalin made a speech at the Bolshoi Theatre in Moscow for the Soviet elections, where he congratulated the country and the party for its victory in World War II, but he had blamed capitalist politics for starting it. Stalin explained that the massive industrialization efforts done throughout the 30s were vital for the country's success in World War II, but continued saying that more would have to be done for the future, possibly another 3-5-year plans, so quote, that we can be sure that our motherland will be insured against all contingencies, unquote. The speech, all things considered, is remarkably tame, in the sense that it's not really anything Stalin hadn't been saying for years. It nevertheless seriously spooks Western observers, one of whom was Supreme Court Justice named William Douglas, who told the Navy Secretary James Forrestal that Stalin's speech was a, quote, declaration of World War III, unquote. And not everyone was so outraged though. Ambassador Avril Harriman, for example, when he came home from his time in Moscow, tried to downplay the significance of the speech, telling reporters that Stalin was more talking to his own people than to the Americans, and that, quote, they are now being asked to support another 5-year plan, and that will mean hard work, unquote. Washington struggled to understand the Soviets' behaviour, so the US State Department looked for answers from experts in Moscow. Soviet specialist George Kennan answered the call. He was a man who was dying to have someone in Washington listen to him after essentially being ignored for years, and when they finally were listening, this is what he came up with. A 5,000 word explanation on who the Soviets are, how they think, and what to do about them. The document's known as the Long Telegram, and it's the result of a decade's worth of experience that Kennan amassed while in the Soviet Union. I won't read it all, but the basic points were this. Kennan explained that as far as the ruling elites in Moscow were concerned, there could be no permanent peaceful coexistence between the Soviets and the Western capitalists. Kennan goes on to explain that the Soviet rulers had some basic conclusions about geopolitics with the capitalist West. He says Moscow thinks Western capitalism would generate wars, either wars between themselves or against socialist countries like the USSR. Importantly, a war against the USSR had to be stalled at all cost, but a war between rival capitalist countries held great opportunity for the Soviets if they remained powerful and ideologically unified. Kennan makes the distinction between what the party leaders think and what the regular Russian people think, because despite the propaganda from the top down, the thinking between the two aren't necessarily the same. But that, at any rate, it's the party elites who the West will have to contend with. The Soviet elite's view of the outside world, Kennan says, isn't based on objective analysis, it comes from something else. He writes this interesting paragraph as an explanation. He says, quote, "At bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is the traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity." He continues, quote, "Russian rulers have invariably sensed that their rule was relatively archaic in form, fragile and artificial in its psychological foundation, unable to stand comparison or contact with political systems of Western countries. For this reason, they have always feared foreign penetration, feared direct contact between Western world and their own, feared what would happen if Russians learned the truth about the world without, or if foreigners learned the truth about the world within." Unquote. Communist ideology, Kennan reasoned, was a, quote, "fig leaf of their moral and intellectual respectability. Without it, they would stand before history at best as only the last of that long succession of cruel and wasteful Russian rulers who have relentlessly forced the country onto ever new heights of military power in order to guarantee external security of their internally weak regimes." Unquote. He continues, "This thesis provides justification for that increase of military and police power of the Russian state, for that isolation of Russian population from the outside world, and for that fluid and constant pressure to extend the limits of Russian police power, which are together the natural and instinctive urges of Russian rulers. Basically, this is only the steady advance of uneasy Russian nationalism, a centuries-old movement in which conceptions of offense and defense are inextricably confused, but in new guise of international Marxism, with its honeyed promises to a desperate and war-torn outside world. It's more dangerous and insidious than ever before." Unquote. Kennan goes on to warn that, quote, "everything possible will be done to set major Western powers against each other." Unquote. Although he continues on saying that the Soviet Union, quote, "does not take unnecessary risks, impervious to logic of reason, and it is highly sensitive to logic of force. For this reason, it can easily withdraw, and usually does, when strong resistance is encountered at any point. Thus, if the adversary has sufficient force and makes clear his readiness to use it, he rarely has to do so. Thus, their success will really depend on the degree of cohesion, firmness, and vigour which the Western world can muster." Unquote. Kennan's report took Washington by storm. It spread like wildfire, thanks largely to the fierce anti-communist James Forrestal, who doted on Kennan's ideas and made the telegram required reading for his staff. Now, Kennan's telegram didn't start the Cold War, but it was an intellectual justification for it. Kennan later protested about how the telegram was interpreted, but Washington heard the message they wanted to hear: stop the Soviets at the door. Keep in mind the bigger picture here too. The powers that be in America are hearing this advice while a spy ring is discovered in Canada. In Iran, the Soviets are overstaying their occupation because they want Iranian oil concessions. And in Fulton, Missouri, Churchill is making his Iron Curtain speech, proclaiming that Europe is being split into two worlds. There's major pushback against that speech, by the way. There was a lot of people in America that considered it flat-out warmongering against the Soviet Union, who the Americans were still officially on friendly terms with, despite the underlying tensions. Churchill's speech also outraged Stalin, who called it a call to war with the Soviet Union, to which Truman, who was in major damage control mode, offered Stalin to come to America to make a speech of his own, although Stalin refused. Churchill, though, had been trying to corner the Americans in against the Soviets for a while. In fact, his Iron Curtain speech isn't even the first time he used the phrase. He'd written it in a letter to Truman months before, when he was trying to guilt trip Truman into keeping a large American force in Europe to keep pressure on Moscow. The Americans were resistant to British anti-Sovietism at first, but after Kennan's long telegram, the situation would change. Down by Turkey, the Soviets had further interests. See, Stalin wanted joint control over the Turkish Straits because it gives him reliable access to the Mediterranean, and it's been an old Russian dream to have it since the Empire days. So Stalin, in order to get the Turks to agree to joint possession, starts putting the pressure on with military exercises in the Black Sea. The Americans, though, don't like this one bit. They saw it as evidence of Soviet expansionism. Eastern Europe was one thing. The Soviets already reigned there. You couldn't really do anything about it. But down south, it was a different story. From a strategic perspective, if you're the US, Turkey as a whole is pretty important. if you let Turkey get dominated, well, then you don't know what happens next. Suddenly the entire Middle East is under threat. And that's not me speculating on American interests either, by the way. They say this. Also, worth keeping in mind, the Middle East is home to a pretty vital resource. For example, Turkey's neighbour, Iran, has the oil, the importance of which is not lost on the Americans. Anyways, Washington tells the Turks to hold their ground while Truman sends a naval task force to reinforce them, and the Soviets decide not to chance it and subsequently back off. Now, that minor showdown was an enlightening one because Kennan had said that the Soviets would try and push for everything they could, but never risk an all-out war if the Americans pushed them back on something. The events in Turkey are pretty supportive of that claim, and it cleared things up for a Truman administration who had struggled to find a coherent policy in regards to Moscow. But Turkey wasn't the only flashpoint in this region of the world, because at the same time there's major developments in Greece, which ironically the Soviets won't have anything to do with, but more on that in a second. See, Greece had been experiencing complicated political instability for years. Italian invasion, German occupation, and even a civil war. But by 1946, they were embroiled in another nasty civil war between the communists and the royalist Greek government. Now, initially, Greece was a British interest. The Brits had funded partisans with the aim of keeping Greece out of German hands first, and then their focus shifted into keeping it out of communist hands. The problem was, by 1946, as the Greek civil war was raging again, the Brits were exhausted from fighting the Axis, so they couldn't keep up their support for the royalist Greek government who were fighting against the communists. London was already stretched thin. Their empire was crumbling, their population was war-weary, and their economy was in tatters. Worth noting, by the way, the British had introduced bread rationing in 1946 because they were exporting food to Germany, whose entire society was so destroyed that they couldn't even feed themselves. If this wasn't bad enough, Europe was rocked by a particularly brutal winter in 1946-1947, which made London's situation even more precarious, which meant that Greece, as geopolitically important as it was unsustainable for the British to remain involved with. In desperation, Clement Attlee's Labour government basically asks the Americans to take over. The Americans knew the British needed help with Greece and were actually willing to do it since the Truman administration had somewhat come around to getting tough on communism. The problem was the Republicans held control of Congress. Truman and the Democrats didn't, and for something as big as funding a war an ocean away, Truman needed to convince them that it was a good idea. So on the 27th of February 1947, Truman gathers a few congressional leaders to informally test the waters for an aid package for the Greeks and the Turks, and he brings along General Marshall and Dean Acheson to argue the case. Now supposedly, General Marshall was the first to outline the situation. General Marshall was a respected figure. Truman really admired him, but he apparently did not do a good job at explaining to these very skeptical congressmen why America suddenly needed to send millions of dollars across the world, especially to an area that was really more a British fixation than theirs. General Marshall bored the congressman, it looks like, so Acheson basically steps in to sell the point better, it seems, at least according to himself. Acheson pulls out the big guns. He basically says that if we don't do anything now, we could find ourselves in a world that's 2/3 communist. If Greece fell, the surrounding countries would be next, like, quote, apples in a barrel infected one by rotten one, unquote. One of the congressmen, Arthur Vandenberg, supposedly told Truman after Acheson's speech, saying, quote, Mr. President, the only way you are ever going to get this is to make a speech and scare the hell out of the country, unquote. Over the next few weeks, policymakers debated on how exactly the aid package was supposed to be sold to the American public. It had to stress the struggle between freedom and totalitarianism. It had to be provocative, with clear hints that it was talking about the Soviet Union without mentioning the Soviet Union itself. That was very important. The speech had to demonstrate that everything America stood for was at stake. Truman makes a speech on March 12th, 1947.
The very existence of the Greek state is today threatened by the terrorist activities of several thousand armed men led by communists.
The speech is pretty long, but it frames things in a way that Truman wanted them to be seen. I mean, he mentions more than once how Greece have made an urgent appeal to the USA for help, but he understandably leaves out the fact that the USA not only told the Greeks to ask for help, but also told them exactly what to ask for help with. He also referenced how the Greek government was imperfect, which was a nice way of putting it. You know, one advisor, a guy called Paul Porter, wrote to Truman on March 3rd telling him that, quote, "You are aware of the complete reactionary nature of the present Greek government, but one must work with them as I have to understand how incredibly weak, stupid, and venal they really are," unquote. There's another point where Truman heavily implies that the Soviets have an involvement in Greece, that they were trying to impose their will there. I've mentioned it already. I think it's important to reiterate. The Soviets didn't have anything to do with Greece. Stalin wouldn't help the Greek communists, despite what the State Department thought. The real culprits were the Yugoslavians, and to a certain extent the Albanians and Bulgarians. Historian Norman Naimark, in his book Stalin and the Fate of Europe, he puts it this way, quote, "In any case, Dimitrov, Hoxha and Tito all felt greater affinity for the revolutionary struggle of their Greek comrades than did the Soviet leaders, whose assessment was based strictly on the calculations of great power realpolitik." He continues, "Of course, one should not assume that the policies of the Balkan communist leadership towards the Greeks were not also motivated, at least in part, by their respective countries' own immediate security concerns. The Albanians were acutely aware of the Greek claims to northern Epirus, while the Yugoslavs and the Bulgarians were seriously worried about the fate of Macedonia. Therefore, all three leaderships were supportive of the Greek partisans' disruptive actions against royalist adventures in the north," unquote. He continues on, "Stalin's viewpoint was different. On various occasions, he stated that the Greek partisans should give up their struggle, which, as he saw it, was doomed. If the Greeks carried on fighting a losing battle, he told the Bulgarians and Yugoslavs, then this only made it more likely that the Americans and the British would intervene in the Balkans and force Soviet military action. If, on the other hand, the Greek royalists won, Stalin predicted, the effect on the rest of the Balkans would remain limited." The relationship between Stalin and the Yugoslavs is too complicated for this video, but Tito's insubordination to Moscow eventually causes a split in the communist world, and the Yugoslavians get kicked out of the Cominform in June 1948. Anyways, returning back to Truman's speech in March 1947, he wraps up by asking for $400 million in aid, or a cool $5 billion in today's money. After a few weeks of debate, the aid package is approved and Truman signed it into law in May 1947. Weapons and advisors flood into Greece to help the government in their war against the communists. It was a vicious conflict, but the communists end up losing when, after the Stalin and Tito split, the Greeks threw their lot in with Stalin, which was disastrous for them because Tito was the one actually giving them assistance, which he stopped doing after they sided with Moscow. This civil war in Greece, though, was a watershed moment for the Americans. Aid to Turkey and Greece, as well as to wider Europe under the Marshall Plan, was a clear sign that America would be taking a far greater interest in global affairs. This only became more evident when, in 1949, Truman signs the North Atlantic Treaty, or NATO, which means that American interest in Europe would be backed by a military commitment, something they hadn't done before. After World War I, the Americans helped make the League of Nations, and then they don't even join it. For them to be in a transatlantic defensive alliance 3 decades later was a big step for the Americans in becoming the world's policeman. The very same year, the Soviet Union detonates their first atomic bomb, breaking the US monopoly on the weapon, and Washington loses its mind. But if that wasn't bad enough, a few months later, Mao would declare the creation of the PRC, meaning that China was now communist controlled, which was politically damaging for Truman because he got blamed for losing China. In order to curb the communist threat, the Americans set about designing a strategy for the Cold War. What they came up with and what they showed Truman would literally be the bedrock of American foreign policy for decades. This is what they came up with. It's called NSC 68, or National Security Report 68. It was put together by Paul Nitz, who replaced the somewhat neurotic George Kennan as head of the State Department's policy planning staff, a decision made by then Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who had been getting real sick of Kennan's moralizing rants. Acheson wanted someone who could give him an actual plan, a strategy he could work with moving forward against the Soviets, which Kennan wasn't really doing. So Nitz gets the job officially on January 1st, 1950, and soon after he presents NSC 68 to President Truman. It's a big document, by the way, nearly 70 pages, and it was written to convey a sense of fear and urgency to anyone who read it. For example, it says, quote, "The Soviet Union, unlike previous aspirants to hegemony, is animated by a new fanatic faith, antithetical to our own, and seeks to impose its absolute authority over the rest of the world," unquote. The document highlights 4 possible courses of action for the US to take, but it was really only arguing for one, and that was to build up political, economic, and military strength for itself and the free world. This meant increasing the military budget, providing aid to allies, getting better at intelligence activities and psychological warfare. There's one here that says, quote, "The development of an adequate political and economic framework for the achievement of our long-range objectives," unquote. To pay for this, it advocated for tax increases and cuts in domestic programs in order to fuel this new defense expenditure. When President Truman reads this report, he's kind of half-hearted about it because it comes with a pretty hefty price tag. This heightened military readiness isn't going to be cheap. It's also going to be a tricky thing to convince the country that it's necessary. As it happens, the perfect excuse to implement all this stuff is right around the corner.
Bradley, comes news that communist troops have invaded southern Korea. In swift response,
The Korean War shocks the Americans into action. Whatever doubts anyone had that communism was on the move were absolutely crushed when the North Koreans crossed the border into the south. Now, between you and me, this war had been brewing for a while. Both Korean leaders, Syngman Rhee in the south and Kim Il-sung in the north, had been dying to annex the other. And in the case of the south, the Americans wanted nothing to do with that. In the case of the north, though, Stalin eventually gives the go-ahead for the North Koreans to launch their invasion, and that was optically important because it spooks the Americans and thus allowed for the adoption of what NSC 68 was advocating for. The war ended as a stalemate, but the point had been proven. America needed to get serious about its military preparedness. US defense spending triples during the Korean War and stays high throughout the Cold War and beyond. Not World War II levels of spending, but still a significant amount. Also, from the Korean War onwards, you see a massive surge in the power of the CIA. The CIA had been created in 1947, and Truman had only really intended it to analyze and organize data. He didn't intend it to be a powerful organization, but throughout the years, it became a beast of its own, acting as a powerful weapon for US foreign policy. But that is a story for another day.